Welcome everyone. So happy to see you all. Amazing. As we have people trickling in, I would love to welcome you all to the second session of GSF's Community of Practice on Innovative Financing. Thank you for everyone who is joining us today. So glad that you didn't have any trouble. For those of you who joined us last time, I know there were some technical difficulties, so I'm really glad that's all sorted. Today is a very special session. We are going to be focusing on designing and implementing outcomes-based financing mechanisms. And we have a fantastic set of experienced speakers joining us. And we'll be looking at outcomes-based financing from different perspectives. But before we get into this, can I quickly ask everyone who's joining to just drop in their name, organization, location, and on a scale of 1 to 5, what is your experience with outcomes-based financing? This will also give us an idea of who's in the room and where you're at currently. Priyanka, if I could just request you to also drop this into the chat. And as we put this into the chat, if I could just give you a couple of housekeeping guidelines. Very quickly, this session is being recorded so that we'll be able to share the recording and resources with you afterwards. Please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. Please use the chat throughout the session for questions and reflections. We'll pick up questions during the Q&A. We have two different sections for Q&A, and we will be giving you time to ask the speakers the question. We'll also be collecting them and posing them to the speakers. And because this is a community of practice, we very much want for this to be a participative session. Please do keep the chat active, tell us your experiences, ask questions, respond to what others are saying. The aim is for this to be a space where we can exchange and learn from each other. Very quickly, I'm just going to walk you through what the agenda for today is going to be. I will be just telling you a little bit about GSF for those of you who may not know about us or are joining one of our sessions for the very first time. We'll then hand over to EOF. So we have Milena and Bethany who are going to tell us how outcomes funds are designed and how those choices came together to create the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge. We are going to be using quite a few acronyms because there are very, very long words in this particular session. So just to tell you, OBF, Outcomes-Based Financing, SLEIC, Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge. I will drop it into the chat, and I'll also request the speakers if there are other short acronyms that they're going to be using, let's just drop it in the chat so everyone's on the same page. We'll then hear from Job from Rising Academies, who's going to tell us about his experience of implementing SLEIC. We'll pause for Q&A here. That is the first block where we get to ask the speakers questions. Then we have Sebastian from Instiglio, who will take us through the Bogota case study on performance-based contracts, another type of OBF mechanism, which is based in early childhood care and education. And we'll finish off with another set of Q&A and then peer sharing if time allows for it. And finally, with closing from the speakers. Without wasting too much time, because I know you're here to hear what the speakers want to say and not to listen to me, I'm going to quickly tell you about Global Schools Forum. GSF is a network of locally led organizations working in education with governments and other partners in low and middle income countries. At the very heart of GSF is a collaborative global community of locally led organizations. Since 2017, we have reached 230 organizations across 72 countries, collectively reaching over 163 million children. The network broadly consists of two types of organizations. We have about 50% are school operators who are offering direct education services themselves or through governments across ECD, childcare, and secondary. Other 50% are more broadly education support organizations that provide services like teacher certification, financing support, etc. Over half of our members are based in Africa, growing presence across Asia and Latin America. And how we support organizations is by providing access to know-how and evidence. We connect research practice by building toolkits and resources. We conduct study tours and host online learning events such as this one. We also facilitate access to funding. We increase finance flow into education by creating connections between members, funders, and the broader education sector. We also act as a sub-grantor through our labs program, where we provide catalytic funding to organizations and layer it with technical assistance. And finally, and where this session also fits in, is we are expanding access to partnerships. Many of our members are keen to partner with other organizations or with governments, so we try to bridge that gap at a national or regional level. Now, why this session and where does this session come in? We had a session last year where we were talking about outcomes-based financing and just learning about the different types of mechanisms. Today, we really wanted to come with something a little bit deeper. So we are going to be speaking to you about how these outcomes-based financing mechanisms, OBFs, are designed. Actually implementing and designing these mechanisms raises some very practical questions, such as what outcomes do you pay for? How do you measure them? How do you set targets? How do you structure payments? So today's session isn't just about understanding what it is, but we also want to look at how these mechanisms are designed in practice, the trade-offs involved, and what happens when you actually implement them. And we are bringing together different perspectives, the design perspective, the implementer's perspective, and the government systems perspective, so that we can think about what these lessons mean in many different ways. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first three speakers. We are joined firstly by Milena Castellnou, who's the Chief Programs Officer at EOF. She has over a decade of experience designing and implementing OBF programs and is recognized thought leader in the innovative financing for education and employment space. At UF, she leads the program team and global portfolio of programs, including major education-focused outcomes in Ghana and Sierra Leone. Her work spans across early childhood care and education, basic education, and skills for employment, giving her extensive experience across different sectors and contexts in thinking through how OBF mechanisms are structured and delivered. We are also joined by Bethany Fong, Program Associate at EOF. She has over 8 years of experience managing education programs and building nonprofit organizations across sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, with a focus on how improving learning outcomes through evidence-based and result-driven approaches can work. Her experience includes designing and implementing OBF programs across West Africa. And at EOF, she supports the technical design and implementation of education programs in Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. She will therefore help us make the connection between the broader design principles and how these were applied in SLEIC. And coming right after will be Job Matseshe, Regional Director at Rising Academies in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Job leads Rising's work across a network of public and partner schools, including strategy, government engagement, and program delivery in Sierra Leone. He has been closely involved in Rising's role in SLEIC, including its outcomes-based funding model. His work focuses on aligning non-state delivery models with government priorities, supporting sustainability integration, so he'll bring the important implementer perspective. The reason for these long introductions is because I want you all to know that you're in very safe hands, and with that, I will hand it over to Milena.
Thank you very much, Tejaswini. It's a pleasure to be here today. So if we can put the slides up, I will start talking to you a little bit about what outcomes-based financing is and how to structure the design process. And then Bethany and Job will be able to give you much more practical and kind of, reality anchored kind of examples. I'm sure it's going to be a lot more lively. So to start with, I think to clarify a little bit a few terms here. What are we talking about? So all of these programs fit under the umbrella of innovative finance. Innovative finance is basically everything that is not traditional finance, but there can be two use cases for innovative finance. It can be either to leverage additional resources or to make a more effective use of existing resources. Within that second category, a more effective use of resources is where we find results-based financing or outcomes-based financing. These two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. They both mean tying payments to results. The difference is in the case of outcomes-based financing, we push it further towards the impact. So we pay for outcomes and not just outputs. And then within the umbrella of outcomes-based financing, there's a number of instruments. So you may have heard names such as impact bonds, outcomes funds, performance-based contracts. No need to go into lots of details today and to lose you with these technicalities. But maybe a couple of things to mention. An outcomes fund is an umbrella under which there is multiple contracts. So that means that there's several implementers, which is the case of the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge that Bethany and Job will be talking about. And then we've got impact bonds or performance-based contract. The difference between these two is the presence of an investor. So in an impact bond, there is an investor, an impact investor that provides the upfront financing, whereas a performance-based contract is a simpler type of contract between a commissioner, whether a government or a funder, and an implementer. But all of these, whether, Sebastian will talk to you about a performance-based contract, we're talking about an outcomes fund, they really fit within that umbrella of outcomes-based financing. So an outcome within outcomes-based financing, of course, different organizations, different governments or funders will do it differently. But as I will be speaking about the experience that we take, the approach that we take at EOF, maybe useful to take a step back and clarify who are the different actors that play into these type of programs. For us at EOF, the governments are really our central partners. They play a central role in the education system, and therefore that's with them that everything starts. With them, we define the objectives of the program, we co-design, so we go through all of these stages that we'll talk about together, and we co-manage during implementation. Outcome funders provide funding for the outcomes and are playing a really important role of pooling funding together with government. And then we're able to select a number of implementing partners. Rising Academies was one of them in the SLEAC program. Some of them will partner with impact investor who provide the upfront capital as well as ongoing support during implementation. And then the independent evaluator plays a critical role by confirming whether the outcomes have been achieved. So now, before we dig into the design process, just to clarify that at EOF we've got a whole portfolio of programs that has followed this process. So we'll talk today in greater detail about the SLEAC program because it has completed. It was our first program in Sierra Leone. But in basic education, we're also supporting the government of Ghana with a program as well there, and about to launch in Nigeria in the next few weeks. We've also got a whole portfolio of programs in early childhood care and education already being implemented in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, South Africa, and soon to start in Namibia. But now if we go back and think about the theory here, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the next few slides. How do outcomes funds come about? So there's several stages in the process. The very first one is to start by defining what is the problem that we're trying to answer? What are the barriers to achieving outcomes? And therefore, what is an outcomes fund even the right instrument to use for this? So that's the problem identification and suitability assessment. Then once we have confirmed that it is indeed an instrument that will add value for governments and partners, we then move into the design process. And that's what I'm going to be focusing today, the very technical parameters of that design process. But important to take into account that a really important stage as well of the whole program development is the selection and contracting of implementers. And there's a whole range of specificities in outcomes-based financing for the selection and contracting, but I will not go into this today. And then, of course, there's program implementation and post-implementation and sustainability consideration. So if today we focus on the design, when you think of design, you all think about things like payment metrics, pricing, etc. And I will come to this in a second, but wanted to share some overall guiding principles that you've got to have in mind as you go through this. And obviously, these will take different shapes or form depending on the program itself. The first one is really to recognize that the best design is a design that is consultative and that is iterative. And for us, obviously, as I've mentioned, the governments are at the core of this process. But it's also really important to leverage the expertise that implementers and investors have built through their experience on the ground working in other programs. So we really go through a consultative process with a lot of iterations with our partners so that the program is anchored in a reality. The second piece is to recognize the interdependence of design elements. It is not a sequential linear process where we first figure out what are the metrics and then you move to pricing and then you move to the evaluation. You've got to recognize that each of these elements interact with each other. So the choices that you make when you pick a metric will influence your evaluation methodology. But in the same way, if you have a preference for a specific evaluation approach or you have some specific tools at your disposal to assess the results, then this will influence the type of indicator that you can select. So it is really an iterative process, but also very interdependent. The third element is to recognize that this is not a black and white kind of there is a good design or a bad design process. It is really about making trade-off, assessing trade-offs, and being very thoughtful in the choices you're making. In many ways, it's more like art than science because you've got to consider the different options at your disposal and what are the benefits and risks that they carry. So you may want to push further towards a very ambitious programs, but then this will convey more risk for the implementing partners that they may not be able to take on. So all of these things need to be considered very carefully. And finally, throughout the design process, what you're really doing is thinking about incentives. How do you set up a program in a way that will incentivize particular behaviors? There's the behaviors you want to see, and there's also the behaviors you want to avoid. So when you're thinking, for example, about an OBF program in education, you want learning gains to improve, but what you do not want to see is for the lower performers to be kicked out of school on the day of the test. So that's an example of a perverse incentives. And you need to keep thinking about these incentives throughout the process, whether it's when you select metrics, think about pricing, how to evaluate, etc. So now to go into the different aspects of the design process. So the very first one, of course, is the payment metrics. What are the results that we're paying for? Then we've got what is called payment weight. So that's what proportion of total funding will you attribute to each of the metrics in a context where you've got more than one, which is most programs. The third piece is around target setting and pricing. And then we've got the payment schedule. So when are results paid for? And then equally important is the evaluation design. And evaluation means what results are how are you going to be assessing the results? So what tool are you using and what approach will you be taking to calculate the payments? So if we start with the metrics is really about, or you could call them indicators. It's about identifying, using the theory of change, what are the outputs and outcomes that matter. And we've got a selection of criteria that we use to select these because what you want ultimately is for each payment metric to be meaningful, meaning very well aligned with the ultimate objective you want to achieve with the program, to be measurable, so to be quantifiable. It can't be something too vague or too subjective. Malleable means within the control of the implementer and within the timeline as well. And difficult to game, this goes back to the perverse incentives I was talking about a minute ago. But of course, you do this for each payment metric, and then you've got to think about the basket of metric because when you've got more than one, they can compensate each other. And so, for instance, in the ECC program that we've got, you may have metrics that are more within the control of the implementers, such as access to centers, coupled with metrics which are higher risk, but also more closely related to the ultimate goal, which is all the metrics around quality or ultimate development outcomes of children. So when you've got your basket of metric, you need to think about the payment weights. How much funding do you put onto each metric here? And similar thinking here, you need to think about how each metric is aligned with the program objectives. So you want to put enough weight to the metrics that you really care about, the ones that are linked to the overall impact. But similarly, if you put more weight onto these ultimate objectives, then you're transferring more risk to the providers and the implementers. So you've got to balance these two considerations. And the point around the cost of achieving the outcomes is also an important one, because if you're paying a certain amount of money for a metric that is in effect less than what it costs for the implementer to achieve these results, then you're not going to create the incentives you're looking for. So talking about payment, then you have the questions around target setting and pricing. This can get really technical, so I'm not going to go into lots of details, and we've got a technical brief on it as well that you've got the link for here in the slide. But it really is about thinking about what is the unit that can be achieved. So what are the target is what is the expected level of performance that you can achieve for each indicator. And the price is about how much do you pay for each unit of outcome. And these things are related because in some cases you will know exactly how many units of outcomes can be achieved and how much proportion of the funding needs to be is allocated to that metric. And then this is how you will calculate the price per unit. In other cases, you will actually know what is the price of achieving a unit of outcome, and that is what will determine the total target. So depending on the data that you've got at your disposal and the uncertainties you're working with, there's different ways you can price and determine the targets. So I will go quite quickly about this, but as you finalize your payment function, which is basically how do you calculate the payment for results that implementers can receive, you can think about other elements, such as, for example, is this a linear function or is it a yes or no? So is it a question of like, do implementers get paid proportionally to the results they have achieved, or do they have to achieve a minimum level of results for them to even receive any payment? One interesting element in this can also be the differentiated payment. So we've used this quite a lot at EOF, where we pay a higher price per outcome for certain groups of population, for instance, for girls, as in the SLEIC program, or for children with disabilities in our program in ECC in Rwanda. And then you can also think about the timing of payment and what it means in terms of the cash flow for implementers. And finally, I'll come into the evaluation approach, which is a really critical aspect of the OBF design. So because obviously the evaluation is about confirming whether the outcomes have been achieved, it becomes really high stakes. And so you've got to think about the level of rigor you want to have in your evaluation. And of course, you need to have all parties buying into the evaluation approach and being comfortable that what is being determined is indeed a good reflection of the results having been achieved. So it's important to have enough rigor in your evaluation. But at the same time, you want to balance this with the need to also be cost efficient and make the best use of budget. Or think about the objective of the program. And when you've got, for instance, a government that is thinking about scaling up a particular program, then it's also important to think about an evaluation approach that is scalable and can be used at a much greater scale. So that may lead you to conclude against the use of an RCT, a randomized control trial, for example. So all of these elements are really important to take into account. And you'll see from the SLEAC program that there were actually a lot of lessons learned on evaluation, which Bethany will tell you more about. And I believe that, yeah, that concludes it for the theory. Thank you for bearing with me. And now I'll hand over to Bethany, who will be talking about how we use this approach in practice with the SLEIC program and what were our lessons learned. Thank you.
Thanks, Milena, for sharing on how to design the OBF program. Now I would put more focus on like the SLEIC program, where we actually have like the OBF program in practice. This is the first OBF experience in Sierra Leone and also one of the very first program at GOF. The objective of this program is to improve the quality of like education in Sierra Leone at that time, because like they have just experienced an expansion of access of education before that, but the government now wanted to shift the focus on the learning outcomes. So that's why we have set up this program, and it has reached over 120,000 students from 2022 to 2025. And in the OBF program, there were different stakeholders in different roles and responsibility. There were the government who selected the schools and set the outcomes targets. The EOF, we oversaw the outcomes on behalf of the government. There were 5 outcome funders contributing around 80 million for this program. And there were also 5 implementing partners supporting the schools and like delivering the interventions, and 2 investors taking the risk of the financial cost if like the outcomes were not achieved. After 3 years of implementation, next slide, please, Carolina, thank you. After 3 years of implementation, SLEIC actually achieved a scale and learning impact year on year. There were significant results achieved in both like English and math. And if we translate it into LACE, actually the pupils received around 9 to 12 months additional learning adjusted years of skilling per year in our program. And if you go to the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that the results from some of the intervention models actually exceeded the challenging target that we have set. And there were also a variance in terms of like the outcomes achieved by different intervention models. We would love to highlight that it's actually a feature of the OBF program, where there is like some interventions being more effective than the others. This is actually a quite a good phenomenon in order to help inform the funders and the government as well in terms of like what could be the most effective interventions in that context to inform like their funding or policy decision. And now I have briefly introduced like the program. I will move on to talk more about the design elements of that one. We had two payment metrics in this program. One is the improvement in learning gains, namely English and math, as I mentioned. The second one was the percentage of children achieving the minimum competency. Minimum competency was co-developed together with the government and evaluator in terms of like the threshold or also like the construct of it. The reason why we have this metric is because of like the government priorities where they wanted to encourage more children passing the minimum learning levels at the end of the year, at the end of the program. So that's why we had set aside 5% of the payment allocated to this metric. And in terms of the payment formula, it was calculated by multiplying the number of children attending on a relevant school day by the impact achieved on two separate metrics, and then the price per unit of the impact. If you look closely to the price per unit, that is actually separated by gender, meaning that we have set aside a 20% price premium on the girls as the program wanted to like incentivize the implementing partners to focus on the girls' learning. Next slide, please, Carolina. And now we will move on to talk about how we actually set the target. We used an adaptive approach to set the targets, meaning that the first year target was more based on literature review in similar contexts. And then we used year one results to adjust the targets for year 2 and 3. And in order to accommodate for such target setting process, we has also adjusted the payment mechanism to help share the risk on the implementing partners. Meaning that for year 1, we pay for activities, but not the outcomes. But then in year 2 and 3, we paid 100% on the outcomes achieved. We have also introduced a catch-up mechanism. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, so let's say, for example, in year 1, all the implementing partners were paid on activities and all the payments were out. But then let's say, for example, in year 2, they underperform and there was like a portion of like fundings like unpaid. That would be accumulated to year 3 payment pot. Meaning that if they overperform in year 3, they could actually receive the undisbursed fund in year 2 and max out all the payments that they could get from this program. So this is like a very good catch-up mechanism to incentivize the implementing partners to actually overperform even they could not achieve the results in the previous years. And now we'll move on to talk about the evaluation design. To give a little bit of context, when we were designing that program, there was actually a lack of data evidence in terms of the learning outcomes in Sierra Leone. And the government at that time was not fully adopting some of the international assessment into the system yet. So that had implications on how we actually designed the evaluation. First of all, we chose a more robust evaluation methodology, which is a randomized control trial in this context to make sure that we can prove the impact achieved by the program is actually contributed to the intervention delivered by the implementing partners. And the second design decision is that we tailored an assessment tool, a learning assessment tool, together with the government that was adopted to the local context, aligned with like the SL primary education curriculum. These two evaluation designs, we have a lot of reflections on like on how we can actually do differently in future programs, because like in this program, there has caused quite some concerns over the implementation period, which I will share more on the next slide. But before going to that, I would also love to highlight what actually worked well in SLEIC. Next slide. Thank you, Carolina. First of all, in this program, we have fostered a very strong culture of collaboration. Programs set up different governance spaces for government and implementing partners to actually work together and problem solve some of the implementation issues. The implementing partners themselves, which I'm sure Job will share more, like actually exchange different lessons learned in like formal or informal like peer learning settings. The investor also worked extensively with implementing partners to try to improve like their data monitoring system. And this sense of like collaboration within different stakeholders is something definitely we would love to like continue to see in our recent programs or future programs. The second thing that we will continue to do is like having year 1 payment as activity based. It provided a lot more flexibility to the program. First of all, it gave time for the implementing partner to set up the implementation and their like delivery structure, but also allow some time for the program design decisions to be adapted after the first year of a result, or like after we have collected more data on ground. So we have continued to use this approach with our recent OBF programs, especially when there are greater uncertainties around the local context. But as I mentioned, potentially what we would do differently is on the evaluation methodology, where would choose potentially another like instruments for this for the program. In SL, like EIC, there were quite some concerns from the implementing partners on the instrument too, because they were not familiar with the tool per se. It's new. They were concerned even like if the intended impact from the interventions were actually captured from the instrument tools that we were measuring the impact on. So for future programs, it's definitely important to secure the stakeholder buy-in in terms of the assessment tool that we are using, and also ensure that there is certain level of understanding of like what has been measured in this program. And the second things that we would do differently is like whether to use an RCT or not. In SL context, it actually worked well because like in SL at that time of the program, there were decline in the learning levels at a national level in English. But with an RCT, we were able to actually identify the learning gains like delivered by the implementing partners and protect this program from not being able to measure what actually the implementing partners has achieved. But in general sense, RCT could be costly and could be very rigid to the program design. So that's why even right now in our recent programs, we try to like avoid using RCT unless the government was really like wanting to have like more robust data for the program or for future policy decision. So to wrap up, I would say it's very important to design an OBF program that is flexible and that could cultivate a sense of collaboration. I will stop now and pass on to Job to show more insights on like from an implementing partner perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Let me share my slide.
While Job pulls up his slide, thank you so much, Milena. And Bethany for that very detailed and technical insight into how OBFs are designed and how this was put in and implemented in Sierra Leone. Please do keep dropping your questions in, and now Job's going to tell us how this was actually implemented on the ground.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'd like to introduce, my name is Job. I'm the Regional Director for Rising Academies in Sierra Leone. Over the past 3 years, Rising has been one of the 5 implementing partners for the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge. And it was, for us, it has been a really learning experience and also a challenging environment that we learned and focused on outcomes and making sure that every thought we were doing was on outcome. Then it was the largest education outcome fund globally. And today I want to walk you through how SLIC Outcomes Fund design really played out in practice for us as an implementing partner, where we really focused how we used the flexibility that we were given and where we were given what got hard and what we learned through that time. I think as mentioned earlier by Bethany and Milena, SLIC was a 3-year partnership between the government of Sierra Leone, EOF, and it was launched in the year 2022. It reached over 325 schools, over 120,000 students, and with 5 implementing partners. I want to rest that the design rested on 3 principles that pay for verified learning gains that were key rather than activities delivers. It gave partners room to adapt and keep it very affordable with a cap limit per price per child. The combination for us, the pay for outcomes, building guardrails that we had really shaped everything about how to deliver. And so for Rising, this was our first formal outcomes financed program. So where did we actually focus our energy? We organized around our 3 main pillars: content, coaching, and data. First, our content. Our content focused on structured pedagogy. We provided teachers with daily step-by-step lesson guides aligned to the Sierra Leonean curriculum with clear routines to ensure consistency across classrooms. This enabled us to know that in all the 61 schools that we were working with, every teacher in classroom was delivering the same content consistently with clear guidelines. Second, we managed coaching at scale. We invested in frequent classroom observation with coaches visiting schools every day and spending time in classrooms to ensure that they are able to give feedback. We also introduced low-cost, high-frequency touchpoints, which included technology-based like WhatsApp-based support. So teachers had continuous access to guidance, not just the occasional training workshops and the frequency of the weekly visits that the coaches were coming in to support them with. Third, performance monitoring. We tracked data at school and district level. And so one of the things that outcome-based funding really enabled us is we tried our level best to see how can we quickly collect, identify, and analyze data to enable us understand as soon as possible where iterations need to be changed, are we on the right direction? And so we tracked data at school and district level and used it to differentiate support. Schools with weaker baseline conditions received more intensive coaching. We also embedded safeguarding and government coordination. Improving instructional quality was not just enough for us. So we worked to ensure that children were learning in environments that they felt safe, that they were in school, safe and learning. And so together with the government and the district support officials, school leaders had to make sure that our implementation was not a parallel system, but was coordinated within the existing environment, within the existing government structures. The thing about the partnership we had with EOF is that we had freedom to adapt. And so because SLIC paid for outcomes rather than prescribing delivery, implementing partners were given a lot of flexibility to adjust their models in response to evidence and context. So for us, this meant several things. One concrete example, we redesigned our assessment tools so that we could track interim progress against the RCT design, not just wait for the annual results. That gave us an early warning system. So for instance, we designed something that we call the learning progress test that would administered after every, say, 6 weeks. And this was very granular that allowed us to see where our students are at what particular lesson they are struggling with and be able to advise the teacher back on what else are they supposed to actually go back and reteach. So when this interim data showed a school or a subject is lagging, we could redirect coaching intensity or instructional focus before it showed up in the year-end numbers. Remember this year-end numbers, while we were also collecting our data, this was also externally collected. And so we had to make sure that as the external evaluation is happening, we were strong enough that to understand that these are the results we are going to expect. So the assessment data fed directly into our coaching, conversations, and program management. It became a tool for adaptation, not just a tool for evaluation. We also refined our lesson guides based on what teachers were telling us, because we consistently are asking ourselves, how can we improve delivery so that the outcome is actually the ones that we're expecting them? And so having this conversation with teachers enabled us to that when data showed that certain schools were not responding at the same rate, we differentiated our school support. Our support based on the baseline conditions, the attendance pattern of the teacher, of the students, and the teacher capacities that we got at that particular time. For us, this wasn't a new territory for Rising, but SLIC really sharpened what was the focus. Every operational design had to link clearly to instructional impact within this particular project. Of course, there were quite a number of challenges, and operating in some of the environments that we do, like in Sierra Leone, some of the challenges that we did face were not easy, but I have to be honest about some of these challenges. Like operating under an outcome-based contract meant assuming real delivery risk. And the RCT structure meant we couldn't lean on the anecdotes. We needed reliable environment, see how well do we do the right intervention. So we faced 4 major challenges, if I would put if I look at them into the 4 major challenges, but there are other smaller ones that I know service providers faced, and we had opportunities to speak together and came up with it. So the first large was a large mixed ability classrooms of 60 to 80 people who are very common in the public systems. And when I say mixed ability, sometimes we had classrooms where you're grouping grade 2s and 3s or grade 5 and 6 into one particular classroom because we didn't have enough teachers for that particular system. The second is the system really relies heavily on volunteer teachers and motivation varies. Another challenge we faced was that when we started, actually, math super responded more powerfully than English, which for us suggested maybe deeper structural factors in literacy, including language of instruction or the language that students grew up learning. Beyond language of instructions, maybe the curriculum pacing and teacher proficiency that extended beyond a single intervention. And lastly, operating under an outcome-based contract meant assuming delivery risk and maintaining tight alignment between cost structures and instructional priorities. What do I mean here? That as we are consistently implementing, we are assuming that we are making the right implementation that is actually going to give us the right outcomes at the end. And so in between here, while we are looking at the assessment data every other day, we do not know 100% of what the outcomes are, and just relying on the interim data that we had consistently and asking ourselves, is this the right data that we have? Is it leading to the right outcomes? And so how did we address the challenges that we identified them? So internally, we really redeployed our experienced staff to the hardest hit schools based on the data that we had. So we restructured coaching to target volunteer teachers specifically and increased our coaching cadence to groups of schools that we did have. And so we did classify schools based on high performing, moderate, and super schools that required a lot of support, and then met the schools at the level of support that we felt they needed. And this, we consistently iterated beyond increasing our coaching cadence. We iterated the lesson guides for multiple level instructions. We strengthened our all internal review cycles and concentrated support where it was most likely to shift our outcomes. So where we saw schools that are struggling with attendance, some of the support that we actually did was see how do we encourage communities to push Our research team also super refined our literacy design based on the subject level results. When we saw literacy was struggling, our research team super reached out and make sure that we are getting the results that we needed, and we are making sure that the design of our program is reaching out. Externally, we had super strong partners to support us. EOF is here. I remember constant conversations with Beth and Milena and the team. We did have a really amazing partner with Bridges, and we are also regularly convened with peer learning forums with all the 5 implementing partners, who we shared all our experiences working within the same environment with different things. So it felt like a space for very honest conversations on what was working, what we felt others needed to add into the implementation, because we had a shared goal that the students in Sierra Leone needed to learn and be better at their foundational literacy and numeracy. So the Ministry of Education also played a really key role in ensuring that we are all coordinated, we had all the access. And for us as Rising, Bridges Fund Management provided the upfront capital that constantly challenged us to use our data to target the interventions more precisely. Of course, Oxford Policy Management provided the rigorous RCT that really kept us honest. The first year of results, we looked at it together. The second year of results, we were like, oh yeah, we are making progress. And the third year of results were there. And so we could not claim credit for every gains that we are independently, but this was definitely a joint team effort. On my previous slides, I explained how the outcomes-based setups give us the freedom to iterate as needed. But over the 3 years, I wanted to share a little bit about the iterations that we made before I hand it over back to Tid. So the first is we had a stronger outcomes discipline. Teams became more analytical and systematic in reviewing assessment data and ensuring it translated into timely adjustments in delivery, teacher support, and instructional practices. That every conversation we spoke was not focused on how are we implementing, but the question was, is that action going to lead to a measurable outcome? Is it going to lead to a better outcome in literacy? Is it going to lead to a better outcome in numeracy? Second, there was a pure adaptive management under evaluation. So the structure meant we tracked interim indicators carefully and adjusted delivery strategies based on the emerging patterns. So where performance lagged, like for instance in literacy, we redirected coaching intensity. Where it came to management, we also noted differentiation across schools. Not all schools responded at the same rate. So we tailored the support based on the baseline conditions, the attendance patterns, and the teacher capacity that we received in the schools that we were working with. And so thirdly, the structure, we really structured our coaching at scale and strengthened our coaching cadence, including how coaches interacted in the schools, the role that we wanted the heads of schools to play, and how Rising as a whole is viewing the coaching support to the schools that we did. And so this is just a snippet of what the outcomes-based model and made Rising really sharpen its implementation outcome and just have a clear and stronger focus on what is the end goal. While everything we are doing was towards making sure that we are sharpening our implementation, but the end goal, the target, the North Star, was, are we going to deliver outcomes? And that is what our experience was. And we are excited that we did get very positive outcomes for the schools that we worked with across all the 5 implementing partners. Thank you so much. And I'd hope to stop here.
Thank you so much, Job. Thank you. I think that nicely ties in the entire life cycle that we were trying to showcase here, and the chat is also buzzing quite a bit. I think if anybody wants to unmute, please do feel free to unmute and ask questions directly as well. Or if you prefer to raise your hands, we can also call you. And while you think of some of those questions, there are some that have started coming in the chat. So I suppose this first one will be both for Milena and Job from different perspectives. So Krishna asked, how were pervasive incentives minimized or dealt with in this specific SLEIC example? And how do you deal with them in other programs? So maybe, Milena, would you want to start with that, followed by Job?
Yeah, of course. So I would say that in this type of programs that is seeking to kind of improve learning outcomes in primary schools, there's 2 kind of main type of perverse incentives we can try and think about. One is about the risk of the lower performers in the school being absent on the day of the evaluation or being kind of kicked out of the school, so that the results would show better, that the evaluation would show better results than what is actually happening in practice. And the second one would be around the implementers really focusing too narrowly on the type of results we're evaluating for foundational kind of literacy and numeracy to the expense of other aspects. I just want to say we have actually not seen any evidence of perverse incentives. We've done regular site visits from EOF, but also obviously OPM has been collecting data in all of the schools, but we also had ECARIS, who was a learning partner and has also done a number of interviews, including with communities, head teachers, etc. And the conclusion from their report is that there haven't been any examples of perverse incentives. I think on the first element about the risk of the lower performers not being included, we actually had mitigated this from the payment function. So the way that Bethany explained, we were calculating the payments took into account the number of children present on the score on the test day. So that meant that the implementers had an incentive to ensure broad participation. And on the second one, it was actually really interesting because we had a lot of exchanging on safeguarding, and one could have assumed that because the focus was on literacy and numeracy, that implementers would not put a lot of focus on things like safeguarding. But it's the contrary that we saw, that actually because they wanted to really enable good learning conditions in schools, they worked in a very holistic way. So it also obviously is a function of having, choosing the right implementing partners who are like very mission driven as well. But it's something that we really kept an eye on. I don't know, Job, if you want to share from your perspective.
Thanks, Milena. I feel you've captured a bigger chunk of what I would have shared as well. I think one of the things that I would mention around this is that we were super fortunate enough to have 5 implementers whose focus was all the same. We wanted all the students in our programs to learn. And we're also very excited around making sure that even the students who are struggling were included in the program and making sure that all are part of it. I think we constantly say that we're obsessed about student learning and ensuring that the values that we have does not necessarily make us just to actually be very incentivized to deliver results that for only a few and let others. Because at the end of the days, everyone kept each other honest. The evaluator at that particular point, sometimes we'd meet them in the field and they were having different conversations with the heads of school, asking whether we are out there. And we were really encouraged by this part of where that we understand and we see that whatever we do, someone is watching, and we wanted to make sure that we are not leaving any child behind. I think that resonated for us as Rising, resonated with Educate and all the other service providers that we had. And we were consistently asking ourselves, how do we make sure that these ones are not being left behind? And we're also very honest about our results. If results were not working out, we'd come back and ask ourselves, what are you guys seeing? How can we be better at this? Do you have technical experts that you can support us with? For instance, for us, Bridges linked us to school to school, who super helped us understand saying, how do we build the literacy of the students that we're working with? Because at the end of the day, while the outcomes was to get paid, for the service providers that we were there, our individual goals was to make sure that no student in Sierra Leone is being left behind in the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge.
Thanks, Milena. Thanks, Job. Krishna, I hope that answers your question. If any follow-up, do drop it in the chat. And I think just one question for Bethany. I know there are several questions coming in, and let's do that towards the end after we have Instiglio's presentation as well. But Bethany, Natalia is asking, you showed that targets weren't surpassed in year 2 and that a catch-up mechanism was developed. How did achievement shift across the years of the program? And how do you think design played a role in this?
Thanks, Natalia, for that questions. Well, to answer exactly the proportion of the school that shift achieving the expected outcomes, I have to be honest with you, I cannot answer that because of the design of our evaluation, where we try to focus on the results at the lot level instead of the school level. So we're not actually tracking like the school level changes. We are seeing more like a significant result at the lot level because of like the budget constraint that we have on the evaluation. So this is something that definitely you have to consider when designing OBF program, whether you want to have like more results to be shared with the implementing partners, which actually like the implementing partners in Sierra Leone ask for. Like they would love to see more data from like the school level, and how can we actually design an evaluation that can facilitate that. That is also one of our lessons learning in this program. But I could say that at the lot level, there are 2 lots achieved like impact year on year, and one of the lots even like overachieved on 2 consecutive years. So that's definitely there is a variance of in terms of the outcome. Some of the lots can overachieved, some of the lots is lagging behind, but then able to catch up a bit like in the year 3. So that's why it's good to have that catch up mechanism in the OBF setting. And I saw there's also one questions about how to differentiate the impact, we do that by using RCT, and we are like happy that we have RCT in this program, in a sense that like by randomly selecting the schools receiving the intervention and versus the school not receiving the intervention, we can compare the difference of like their learning gains on two groups, such that we can like determine what are the actual learning impacts achieved by the implementing partners on those who receive the intervention. And but that also means that it would make the evaluation much more costly, because you're actually like having another group of implementing a group of schools that you have to be evaluated. So that's something you have to like consider the trade-off when you design the program. I will pause here first for going back to Tejaswini.
Thank you so much, Bethany. We will come back to questions. I'm now just, please give me a second to pull up my screen. And now, as we are speaking about OBF, and as Milena mentioned, there are several types, we are going to shift our focus a little bit. And we are going to look at another financing instrument, which is performance-based contracting. And we are going to be speaking to Sebastian Osorio-Boyos, who is the director at Instiglio. Sebastian has over 15 years of experience in research, analysis, and leadership, working with stakeholders across Colombia's public and private sectors to align incentives, innovate in financing, and turn ideas into measurable change. At Instiglio, he leads the strategy in Latin America to encourage governments, donors, and philanthropists to use results-based approaches as a tool to ensure that every dollar invested in development achieves the greatest possible impact. Today, Sebastian will share the Bogota experience, including how performance-based contracts was designed, the lessons from implementation, and some of the barriers to scaling this approach through this public system. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you. Perfect very much. Give me a second, I share my screen.
Yes.
Okay, can you see it there?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'm struggling. I only have one screen today. But okay, thank you, Tejaswini, Milena, Bethany, and Job. I think you all set me up for these perfectly. And then Milena, you said, what I'm about to show you is a performance-based contract. And the difference, you name it, the whole story. No investor, just a commissioner, an implementer, one contract. And this is one of the type of things you can do in outcome funds. And Job, like something you mentioned, what you just call outcome discipline, is constantly checking whether an action moves a measurable number instead of waiting for the annual RCT or long-term like evaluation to tell you actually what's happening. And Bogota had to build that exact same discipline. And the difference is who had to build it. In Slate, the discipline sat with the implementing partners backed by an investor and independent evaluator checking their work. In Bogota, there was no investor, no external evaluator. So the government did it itself. Like the Secretary of Social Integration had to become one of the one running that discipline, verifying its own provider with its own data. And that's a very different story. Same instinct you described, but just how do you move it inside the government? So let me tell you a little bit about the Bogota case and why is this interesting. And, Bogota Early Childhood Agency sits within the Secretary of Social Integration. Bogota is a 10 million people city. They have a huge budget for social integration. Is the largest secretariat in the city, something around $2 billion a year for different social programs. And they have a target, how to raise attendance from 94,000 children from a 2024 baseline of about 71. So, and then also opening 30,000 new slots. And when they look at their own operation, three numbers stood out. Yeah. First one is like 800 slots sat empty while children waited to get in. Enrolled and paid for, but not attending. Only 23% of children reached the retention threshold the program was designed around. And it was only a threshold of retention about like attending half of the year, like 160 days a year. And the Secretariat had zero systematic way to measure whether the education being delivered was any good. So let me be blunt about those numbers. That's not a success story. That's a diagnostic. It's what real public system look like before you fix it. And I think what's more useful in this room is that this is more useful to this room that a clean number will be. And the response for these was designing a performance-based contract. So we worked with the Secretariat to implement $9 million contract, performance-based contract, that it was aimed to target 4,800 children, 35 childcare centers, and more or less 6% of the budget of this was tied to results and three metrics: timely attendance, retention, and quality measured with the IMSEIC, which is a Colombian adaptation of the MELQ instrument. And we pay 30, 30, and 40 of that 6%. And the first round of results that happened during last year, attendance held or improved almost everywhere. On retention, where it was weak, it tracked cleanly with low attendance payment, a real intermittency problem, not a data problem. And on quality, 3 centers out of 35 hit the payment threshold. Everyone else got 0. And now the Secretariat of Integration is working with them on exactly what the gaps the data reveal. And one decided choice we made of these affordable is that all the verification happen inside the Secretariat. They use Sirve, which is their own tracking instrument on top of the supervision that I already do. So no independent evaluator, not third-party cost. It was just the trade-off that we have to do at this moment. And this is like less rigor in the evaluation in exchange for having a mechanism sitting inside a government that the government can actually afford to run on its own. So this is kind of the results we got with them. And obviously we are very like kind of as the designers and supporters of the Secretariat, we're very happy about like what they achieve. And this is very, very interesting for us because actually the Secretariat had to completely overhaul their verification methods of what if the attendance happened. All the public governments or the systems we work with, they always tell us, yeah, we pay for attendance, but actually they figure out like once they have to pay for that, and actually once they have the agencies that need to be tracking how they disperse money, they have to be more rigorous about like how actually they're paying for it. And that improved completely the way the Secretariat is making sure every children is attending one of these ECD centers. And also for the Secretariat, it was like very interesting on how they, for the first time, they were measuring at a scale quality of service provision, something that, it was just dispersed measurements of some private implementers that never actually got into the government, and it was never decision-making tool for the process of who's the best service provider and how can I make sure actually I'm getting the best one in my city. So those are kind of the little things I can tell you about Bogota, just to begin, because actually this connects to the numbers and actually what is happening here. And actually there's something that we also discuss a lot about, like how these metric and results are actually achieved within a public system. And it's not the technical evidence alone that makes the government adopt these type of projects. And those gaps are in project failures. And we find out that there's 5 structural barriers in public system that produce the failure of having lack of attendance, having not tracking of quality or service provision, and not understanding who's good and who's not. And there's like 5 of them that we have tracked in our work. And the first one is system rigidity. Budget and procurement pay for activities and not results. The second one is political instability. You have short political cycles that put continuity at risk if you lose the program champion. You have regulatory barriers, especially financial management rules make it hard to pay for results verified after the fact. And it matters whether the rule is external and fixed or internal and something the agency can change itself. Then you have the verification burden, and there's a lot of real verification costs when you want to when you want to do these programs, and where data systems are weak, that cost can eat the efficiency gain that you were chasing. And there's provider capacity, and depending of the context you're working, if it's a city like Bogota, you might find some interesting service provider. If it's a rural community in the Colombian Amazon, that'll be way more difficult. And results-based contracting asks providers to, at least for some part, to pre-finance delivery and absorb some risk. And most small operators don't have the working capital to do it. So good technical design does not solve any of those 5 barriers. It just tells you where to hit them. And something very important about what Milena was talking about, and what Bethany was thinking about, where are the metrics? You need also to think about these barriers when you're designing your instruments, because you will find all of them, like especially when you want to work with the government. So one friction in detail that I can tell you about, one concrete example, because abstraction don't stick. So CIRVE, the Secretariat-owned verification system, produce payment delays up to 5 months for every center, every run. So when child transfer between centers, their attendance history was erased. So providers had to reconstruct it by calling parents, and some parents just stop answering. It's difficult to find where the children is when they move from neighborhood, or some, like 8% of the children that are attending most of these ECD centers are Venezuelan migrants, and they usually are moving from cities or from towns. And that's not a technology failure so much as an institutional one. The system is built for supervision, and we need to repurpose for payment under load it wasn't designed for. So multiply that friction by 9, because there were 9 of these ECD centers getting paid by this metric, and you understand why the metric was well designed. It's not about the mechanism is working or not. So we were thinking about like how you make sure, even though you're paying for attendance or permanence of children, you need to think about like how those system works, and actually the government able to track or not the payment metrics you're supposed to be pushing for. So our approach to navigate those barriers, especially on how to, for every barrier, have a concrete move, is not a best practice list, is what project on data told us to change. On rigidity, let results-based fund pay for capacity strengthening, not just compliance, so a provider can earn incentive that can rebase in actually what helped us improve. And this is something that I think Job was talking about, flexibility also in the funding. The second one is political instability. And like we were trying to also make sure the government was closing some gaps and actually applying some technology that can be there no matter who's the mayor of the city. And for example, we are trying to push toward biometric attendance verification integrated into performance management somewhere. So it doesn't depend who's in charge, who's going to decide, who's going to be the supervisor, is going to be a friend of the ECD center or not. It's a solution that survives staff turnover and change in administration. So which a mechanism has to do if it's going to outlive one champion, like right now, and as Milena was talking, and some of the experiences of EOF, it's also a partnership with the governments, and you need to think like who's in charge. Are they interested in doing this or not? And how you make sure whatever you're doing actually outlives the presence of that person who's supporting you. On regulatory barriers, just fix what the Secretariat can fix on its own. So we updated internal supervision guides and manuals instead of waiting on procurement reforms, because the cycle wouldn't allow for that complete change. On the verification burden, where most of the work sits, because this is the barrier a government controls directly, we separate supervision from verification explicitly. So providers stop experiences to visit as one audit, and we frame verification as learning and not as a sanction. So when they had, for example, the quality of service provision measurement, they start asking themselves questions about like, why the supervision asking me these type of questions? What is my pedagogical experience supposed to be in this case? And that's something that changed how the providers are thinking. And on provider capacity, is just putting technical assistance where the data shows a stagnation. So training, guidance, materials, and especially a direct channel to ask questions before a payment cycle closes and not after. So those kind of are simple lessons from what we have done. And every one of these is achievable without a huge policy change, a new law or a new institution. And that's deliberate. If the fix requires an act of Congress, it's not going to scale, right? It just became a single case study. And this is a lot of the things we're trying to achieve in a lot of different governments in the region. The program is already in the second year of iteration. And what we're trying to do is institutionalize this type of approaches in several governments, not only around Colombia and the region, but around the globe. And this is the contrast I want to leave you with. What you hear from EOF and Sierra Leone is what the results-based financing looks like when you build the full infrastructure around it, independent evaluator, pre-financiers, a fund. And that's a very powerful model. And it can verify things in a government-run system like the Secretariat of Bogota cannot do it. But Bogota is the other half of the picture. 2 actors, no fund, no external evaluator. This is running inside the traditional budget and contracting of the government. And it's a lower rigor, I will say, but a lower cost entry point. And that's exactly the point that we want to do in some of these cases. And this is a design decision. Depending on the type of entry point you have, you need to choose where to go. And most governments that we work with, and some of the governments a lot of you work with, are not going to stand up for a 5-actor outcome fund next year. Most of them could run something like this inside what they already have and starting now. Our first iteration wasn't perfect, and that's precisely its strength. It converted 5 abstract barriers into 9 specific fixable friction and produced 1 concrete design adjustment for each of them. And that loop operation, measure the friction, adjusting the design, it what separates an institutionalized mechanism from a pilot that ends when the grant does. So the structural signal isn't the numbers I gave you, is that the Secretariat is considering making results-based contracting a standard feature of the procurement model and not just one of pilot. And that's institutionalization, not just replication. So to end, my ask for the room is just to fund the generation of evident results. And yes, that's very important about how to measure best early childhood development or quality of service provision, but just as importantly, fund the evidence on institutional capacity, because if not, all those learnings are not going to be part of a government. And how the government navigates its own rigidity, its own turnover, its own regulation within the budget it already has is very important, because the public sector holds the mandate and the infrastructure to reach children at scale. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you for giving us that perspective. Like I said, there are so many questions coming into the chat. I'm just going to quickly throw one question at you. And because there are so many specific questions coming in on design, implementation, and now on performance-based contracts, we're going to open breakout rooms. The audience will get a chance to choose and go into specific breakout rooms. So while my colleague sets those up, Sebastian, I think there's a question for you on provider capacity and where the verifiers concentrated in universities and research centers, and what was the proportion of your costs that were related to verifying these results?
Sorry, let me go through the question, but in terms of capacity, we have 35 centers initially, and they're very mixed capacity on those centers, and actually we need to understand also the political economy. Some of these centers are the only ones in some of the neighborhoods of the city. So you need to work with them. There's no one else in some of these places. So it's very tricky about how you choose those centers and how to incentivize most of them. In this case, and for what we were doing, the Secretariat decided to increase 6% the budget it allocates for ECD centers. So actually, even if no one achieved results, no one was getting punished in this case, right? So that was a design choice, because the Secretariat cannot run a procurement process risking one of these ECD centers saying, oh no, I don't want to participate because this is too risky. So obviously the government knows, out of the 35, I have, X amount of them that are going to be amazing. And we know they're doing a great job. And we know that some of them are not as amazing. And I need this evidence to make sure in the second round or the next procurement process, I can push for them, and I can use also reputational incentives to start ranking them and to tell the community who's good and who's not. And especially, a lot of them are gonna, move towards some other, type of like they want to say, I was the best ECD center. So I think we are using that. What was the other question? Capacity. Proportion of the costs related to verifying results. I don't know if Santiago has the number, but initially it wasn't more. It's just like, when the government procures an ECD center, it has to budget for the supervision of that contract, right? So what we did is like with the University of Los Andes, which is the best private university in Colombia, who did the adaptation of the MELQ to Colombia, we just retrained all the supervision staff that is working on these contracts to actually understand how to apply the instrument, to understand the quality of the service provision. So we didn't add costs to actually the public service, and that was very important because a lot of these supervisors are saying, I'm tired of just having a checklist of logistical things on an ECD center. I want to be thinking about what is the pedagogical experience of children there. So we did that without increasing the cost of supervision, and that's what made this type of experience, being able to institutionalize in the secretariat. And the last question was about, sorry, I lost the last question.
No, that was it. So I think you've
Okay.
answered all the questions. Perfect. Thank you so much. Priyanka, if you could just open the room. So we'll have EOF, Rising Academies, and Instiglio in one room each. Please select the group that you want to go into to ask more specific questions. We know there are very specific questions that you have for the speakers. So please select the rooms and please, you can join these rooms. Let us know if you're having any trouble. How much time? Yeah. Welcome back, everyone. Okay. Everyone who's on video is smiling, so I'm guessing there was some really good discussion. Given that we have 4 minutes to go, could I just ask the speakers from each room to just quickly, in a minute, tell us the discussion that was there and their closing thoughts? Should we start with room 1, EOF?
Sure, happy to. So we had a few questions on the RCT, on the pricing that unfortunately we were not able to answer. So maybe I'll type something in the chat before we close. And also on how to convince government of the value of these programs so that they secure funding. So really, really interesting questions. I think maybe what I would like to share in a closing thought is actually the fact that a lot of these design processes need to be very much anchored in the reality that we're operating in, whether it is the context, the capacity of the implementers, the objective of the program, the structure that we're working with within government, as Sebastian explained. And so that's why the presentation that I did at the beginning, or the guidebook that we've worked on with GSF, really introduces more of a way of thinking about OBF design rather than this is exactly how to do it and this is the type of metrics, because you really need to start by thinking around what problems do you want to solve, what constraints do you have to take into account, and then there's, it's more about providing you with a framework and guiding questions to help you in that process. Yeah, I guess that would be my closing thought.
Thank you so much, Milena, and hand it over to Job.
Yeah, thank you. I think for us, we had 2 questions, and the first question really, Milena has touched about it. It's how as implementers do we navigate the other ecosystem challenges that we're having, the environment that we are in. And so, for instance, you're working within a low-resourced regions where what the government is having in, and also like challenges within the communities and how they're understanding importance of education. And so as implementers, we had to go beyond just focusing on what's happening in the classroom and also putting a little bit effort in getting students to the classroom. And I think one of the things that we have come out with from that particular implementation is that we currently now say we want safe learning spaces, children in classrooms so that they can learn. And I think the other other point where we discussed as well is beyond SLIC, what has been the other key learnings that we have taken into now has become a normal implementation thing. And for us as Rising is a clear obsessed about student learning and making sure that assessments are regular so that we can iterate and see, are we going in the right direction? And also now we are meeting schools at the level that they are at this particular school requires a specific intervention. And so clustering schools to the level they are at and providing like targeted interventions for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Job. And in Stiglio, Sebastian, Santiago, if you would like to give us a brief about your room as well.
Yeah. Oh, Santi. Yeah, go ahead. You can do it.
No, we briefly discussed about, like this governance like challenge you normally have when you're trying to implement something within the public sector, which is basically how you can harmonize the different regulations or the different strategies that you have, like at a national level, at a subnational level, and at an institutional level, which is not necessarily the same. And you always need to understand how you can fit the technical design principles of an OBF mechanism with all these technical issues and challenges you have at the organizational level to actually make the OBF mechanism successful when you are implementing it.
Thank you so much. And I know we are exactly at time. We've just also launched the poll. So before you leave, please do fill that in. But I would just like to give a huge thank you from GSF to all of the speakers today, EOF Rising Academies and Stiglio. It was such a team effort for everyone to come together. I know we have done this last year, but that was a little bit more generic. And there has been a demand from the community more and more to also go into more specifics. So while this might seem a little bit more technical than some of the usual sessions, I really hope that you found a lot of value. Extremely grateful to Milena, Bethany, Job, Sebastian, Santiago, Carolina, Valeria, the entire team, Priyanka. Thank you so much, everyone, and would really request all of you just quickly fill the poll before you drop off. Thank you so much. We will share the resources with you or the presentations that are today, all the resources that have been dropped in the chat where you can further engage with the speakers and the organizations themselves if you have any questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.